Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you being here. Our session today is the bridge from policy to practice, empowering districts to take advantage of state policy flexibilities. And so we are thrilled to have you join us. We're going to take just a moment for each of the three presenters to just introduce ourselves briefly to you, and we would love for you to in the chat, tell us who you are and where you're from as well. That'll help us as we are thinking and talking with one another today. I will start. I'm Stephanie DiStasio. I am the director of the Office of Personalized Learning with the South Carolina Department of Education.
I'll go next. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sarah Bishop-Root, and I'm here today on behalf of work I completed at ExcelinEd in my role as Policy Director of Next Gen Learning.
And my name is John Alfuth, and I am the Director or Senior Director of State Policy at KnowledgeWorks, and we're a Cincinnati-based nonprofit that works with schools, districts, and states to advance personalized competency-based learning policy and practice.
Okay, so to kick it off, I will get us going. And so we do appreciate y'all putting that in the chat there so that we can see that. If you would like access to the slides, I see that our fantastic tech support from Aurora Institute has just dropped the link to the slides into the chat box for you, so you can see those as well. So to get us kicked off, I'm going to give you a little bit of background and just ground us in where we started and how we got here as we talk about this flexibility. So how it started for us in South Carolina. John, if you want to go ahead and advance that. We adopted the profile of the South Carolina graduate in 2012 originally. And this profile of a South Carolina graduate was actually created by district level leaders, district superintendents from across our state who did a lot of work together through our state administrators association, thinking about at the time what we needed for workforce development, what were we hearing on the ground and in our individual communities about what our businesses needed from our graduates. And so those district level superintendents worked together and created the profile of a graduate. It was subsequently codified by our legislature in 2016. So it is part of what we expect in South Carolina for our graduates to be able to do when they graduate high school. This truly is a state codified profile of a graduate. It was also adopted by many other organizations in our state, and so it's definitely prolific in our state. In 2017, the Office of Personalized Learning was created, and the express goal of our office being created was to take this profile that had existed in our state for a few years at that point and make it actionable. How do we take it from being this lovely poster that we have adopted from the walls of all of our schools in the state of South Carolina and truly bring it into action? So that is what we did. And one of the things you'll see on this next little slide, which is pretty visually interesting, and you do have the links, I will tell you the things in here are all hyperlinked for you. So if you want to dive into any of them, you absolutely can. But what we really did was, as we began this brand new office, we thought about the types of supports and resources that our practitioners needed at the classroom level, at the school level, and even at the district level to begin implementing a truly student-centered approach, starting initially with personalized learning and then beginning to really think about competency-based learning as well. And so these are just some of the things that we built out around a regional coaching model, lots and lots of different resources, including social media and podcasts and lots of different types and layers of support and entry points for both individuals, teams, and districts. So that is what we started. However, I will tell you that we began, as we worked with our district leaders to on their journey and moving forward in personalized competency-based ed, we realized that many of our districts were not using existing flexibilities that we already had here in South Carolina. So we had some existing flexibilities, and even though we were building out these supports, people were still not really taking advantage of that. And so sometimes the districts would tell us that they were frustrated by barriers, and sometimes those are real barriers, and sometimes they were perceived barriers. And so that was a conversation we found ourselves having quite a bit. And so to address this, what you'll see in our next slide is that barrier piece. First of all, we thought to ourselves, okay, let's talk about, are these barriers to the system change that we're trying to encourage districts to take on, are these real or are they perceived? And we began by first revisiting some of our existing applications that we already had as a state agency, and then really thought about initially sections within those applications that we could adjust or change to help districts with that process. And so, for example, getting them to identify the specific statutes or regulations that were preventing them from implementing whatever the idea was that they wanted to implement. Sometimes what we surfaced there was, oh, there's not a state statute or regulation keeping us from doing this. Maybe it's a local idea that we are, a local policy. So that was an important piece in that, getting folks to move forward. But it was also really important for us to know and be able to track if it was a state level regulation or a state level statute, so that we could begin to work with districts in a more strategic way. And then also we had them begin to name primary, leading, and long-term indicators of success. And we did that specifically so that we could have them identify specific tools and specific measures that would best help us look at the outcomes for the items and the things that they were wanting to implement. So that was a little bit about how we started. But even during that process, you'll sort of see on this next slide, we realized it became abundantly clear to us that we needed to continue to work to make this process of leveraging flexibility even more transparent and honestly just better supported. So we had the opportunity to work with and learn with other state education agencies. And initially, we actually did that through a group that Sarah worked with through ExcelinEd called a network of state innovation partners. And so really hearing from and learning from other state agencies, seeing what they were doing, got us thinking, got us talking, and got us learning together. And it meant that we realized we needed some support from external partners. And so two of my external partners here on this call, Sarah and John from KnowledgeWorks, and Sarah was with ExcelinEd at the time, to really take that multi-pronged approach that we had towards supporting the work with our professional learning, and really think about, okay, how do we build out something that is going to help us have this cross-agency team. Let's look at our internal processes and begin to make things much more transparent and user-friendly for our districts. And honestly, we needed some help with that. And so we called on our friends, and we worked together to come up with something that we're going to talk to you about here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who can talk about what we came up with.
Thanks, Stephanie. It truly does take a village. So I'm here today on behalf of work, as I mentioned earlier, that I completed at ExcelinEd as Policy Director of Next Gen Learning. I recently transitioned roles, but I'm really excited to share the work of the flexibility guide that we did with Stephanie. So John, will you move to the next slide, please? Other way. Thank you. So at ExcelinEd, in my role as Policy Director of Next Gen Learning, we did a series of research analyses. The first one was a national innovation landscape analysis that really looked at what states are doing as far as student-centered learning, whether it's innovation programs or pilots. And then from there, we took a deeper dive into seat time flexibility for credit. And we looked at across the nation at each state's flexibility around seat time. And we were really surprised to find that actually every state has some level of flexibility from seat time in regards to credit. And so that really started to make us think as a national policy and advocacy organization that, wow, maybe districts and schools actually have far more flexibility in general than they actually know that they have. And from a policy perspective, where that creates a challenge is that if, to Stephanie's point earlier, if districts and schools, when they're trying to innovate, to design student-centered approaches, if they're just creating Band-Aids, then it's really hard to create a feedback loop for policymakers to understand what flexibilities actually need to be codified, or what processes need to be put in place, like waiver requests, to actually make it easier for districts and schools to request the flexibility that they need. So at ExcelinEd, we started to work with states to create flexibility guides that really took a deep dive and inventory of all the flexibilities from statute, rule, and program, and sometimes even local control, that districts and schools could access in their tool belt to design and develop student-centered approaches. And so in total, we've done 7 of these guides. And of course, for every state, they're really unique for the context and dynamics that are within the state. And you know, one of the big findings that I think is really interesting is that as mindset shifts, so, you know, when we're coming from a really kind of traditional system thinking approach, the lens in which we're thinking about how these flexibilities could be leveraged really starts to shift when we start to think about a student-centered lens, personalized lens. And so it's really powerful, I think, in these inventories of flexibilities as we're communicating to districts and schools to contextualize it within the student-centered vision of the state, because it really shifts the way district and school leaders can start to think about how they leverage the flexibilities available to them and weave them together to really design powerful student-centered approaches. Next slide, please, John. So this is just a screenshot, and we really encourage you, Stephanie, would you please pop into the chat the link to the guide? That'd be great. But this just kind of gives you an idea of how we approach the guide. So they typically start out with the context or an opening from the state that really positions the why, the call to action, and then really moves through in almost like a car manual sort of approach of all of, as I mentioned before, it takes the inventory and really makes it digestible. And we tried to, in the South Carolina guide, pull out some examples of how some of the flexibilities are actually being leveraged. And so you're going to hear from John shortly about how this guide was taken to do some further work within the state. Do we have any questions about the flexibility guide specifically before we move on? All right, well, I'll pass it over to John. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And just as a quick reintroduction, my name is John. I work at KnowledgeWorks and have been here for about 1.5 years at this point. So I get the fun job of getting to get down into the nitty gritty of how we then took the vision that Stephanie articulated and the wonderful guide that Sarah and her colleagues created, and then helped try to put in place some of these supports that could really help districts think about how can we actively use these pieces. So I'm going to talk about 2 different pieces today. But first, just a quick overview. So our work in South Carolina at KnowledgeWorks goes back several years, and across KnowledgeWorks, we've included both of our schools team, which works more with schools and districts on implementation, as well as our state policy team. So this current effort that we're talking about here, we started working with Stephanie and her team in early 2022 of this year. And now you've heard Sarah talk about the flexibility guide. And so what we have done is partnered with Stephanie and her crew to really help, again, create a couple of resources we're going to highlight today to think about ways that we can translate the state policy flexibilities into schools and district practice and help them envision not just what they could do, but what is the process they could follow in order to get there. So the first of these is revamping some tools, a specific tool that schools were using to apply for some of these flexibilities. And the second of these is creating a new tool, which we're going to be calling a playbook until I come up with a better name, to help schools envision what this transformation could look like. So first, I want to dig into this thing that's called a proficiency-based systems application. So this is the revamped tool. So what is this proficiency-based system? So this is an opportunity that South Carolina state regulation allows districts to exercise to award credit through this type of system. It lets school districts award credit for school-based or community education experiences. It can be in the school building. It can be outside the school building. It can be the first time the student's taken a class. It can be the second time they've taken a class. So unlike, again, in a traditional setting, the awarding of credit has to be based on mastery, which you can see from the district requirements. The second piece being that a district must identify in their application the method for evaluating proficiency. So now the challenge was that despite having this flexibility, few, if any, school districts were using it in a more expansive way to try to provide personalized or competency-based learning. In fact, the predominant use, I believe, Stephanie can correct me if I'm wrong later, but I think every district in some way, shape, or form was using it primarily for credit recovery. So students that had maybe failed a class and needed to take some summer courses to make that up. So some of the underlying issues that the department had identified is that the application was fairly narrow and that it really guided schools and districts toward using it primarily for credit recovery. They didn't have as much information on some of the options they could do. And lastly, they didn't fully understand always what was possible under this flexibility. And so the solution that they devised and they asked us to work on was to revamp the application to make it designed in a way that was much more clear to stakeholders that the authority was much more broad and could be used in a variety of different ways to offer credits to students through proficiency-based means and not just from the form of credit recovery. So the design process that we used, we executed on several steps. We first conducted a national survey, and I noticed several states on this call. We used some great suggestions and some great examples from states like Colorado and North Carolina specifically to help inform this process. We then took a first stab at writing the application. But before we finalized it, we really wanted to make sure that we had a good understanding of how districts were thinking about the existing ways they could apply it and how they might be receiving the new application to make sure that we didn't actually think we were solving a problem only to either create a new problem or to not actually solve the problem we thought we were creating. So we held a couple of focus groups where we engaged districts, gave them a chance to look over it and tell us, was it making sense? Did this seem like something that would guide them towards a more expansive use of this flexibility? So once we had that flexibility, we incorporated it into the application and worked with the Department of Ed to finalize that process. And the new application should be published in the not too distant future through an online portal that the South Carolina Department of Ed uses for all of its flexibilities. And hopefully, I think, Stephanie, correct me if I'm wrong, but the goal is probably for the upcoming school year, correct?
Yes, correct.
Excellent. So really quick, I want to dig in a bit more to the focus group process in case folks are interested in learning a bit more about this, since promised I'd get into some of the nitty gritty. So it was very, very helpful. We asked participants questions like how easy was it to use, whether it helped them understand how they could use it, and then asked if there were any ways that it still felt unclear to them. They really helped us out and identify some ways the document could be more effectively formatted. There were some areas that were still a bit confusing with them. And as well as how to use a proficiency-based system for both new and already existing courses. So participants also wanted to know how this would fit into their larger strategic visioning process, which is something they have to go through every year as a South Carolina school district through their district strategic planning process. And then lastly, we talked about the metrics that they might use to demonstrate success, with participants having some really good suggestions for how we could add some more tangible questions to the actual application around things like the number of students taking these classes or credits actually being obtained, and that it wasn't just students taking a class, but not actually getting credit for it. And then the last piece that we incorporated into our next resource was that participants continually gave us the feedback that examples are incredibly helpful. So as a last step on this piece, I think just a couple of reflections. As I mentioned, this is going to be published in the coming months, replacing the old application. A couple reflections on the value. So I know for us, it was incredibly valuable being able to look across all 50 states, get an idea of how are other states messaging the ability to use flexibilities. Are there ways that we could maybe crib off of other states that have found successful ways? I mentioned Colorado. They have a great portal where they have all of the different flexibilities that different districts have applied for, listed out, one after another. So it's really easy to see who has applied for what and get an idea of what are other folks doing, for example. We also pulled some ideas from how different states had structured their applications for flexibility in very expansive ways. We also, as already mentioned, used focus groups, which again was incredibly valuable and I think helped us address some lingering issues and concerns that we might not have been able to address had we not had those focus groups and really been able to tease out, was there something that was still confusing in here? For example, we really heard they wanted exemplars. It wasn't always clear to them what type of credit this covered. And then there are just challenges understanding how this fit into other state flexibilities. And so as a next step, the application, again, as I mentioned, is going to be integrated into this set of tools that the South Carolina Department of Ed has that schools and districts can go to. There's a great drop-down menu and you can just select the appropriate application. So it'll be a nice and easy place to collect all this information. So before we move on to the second piece, the playbook, we did just want to pause and see if you had any questions for us around the process for developing, and I guess call it redeveloping, this particular application. And if there are no questions now, that's totally fine. We're going to have another opportunity for questions after the second piece. So keep thinking on them, and we'll pause again before we go to Stephanie to wrap things up after I finish my next portion. So hold on to those for sure. So the second part, and this is actually something that is still in development, but I think it's really exciting, is the creation of an innovation playbook. So as you really heard, within the proficiency-based system application process, districts were repeatedly asking for examples of what innovation looks like. I will say that this is a fairly constant question when we work in states around the country, is that districts might know that they have flexibilities, but they may not know what does it actually look like when they, an end product of the ability to innovate. And then number two, how do they actually get there? So I think Sarah's flexibility guide has done a really great job of articulating what are the flexibilities that do exist. I know I refer to it on a daily basis when I'm doing work around this playbook and some other South Carolina pieces that we've been working with Stephanie on. So to build on the Flex Guide, the department asked us to create a document that would help provide a more concrete vision that schools could aim for, along with a bit some more stepping stones along the way for a path of how to get there, which we have dubbed this resource the Innovation Playbook. So one thing that we again often see in this work again is that schools and districts don't really know what it looks like to change, which really isn't surprising in a system that has looked so similar for so long. We often find several forces that are at work when this is happening. First, even when they want to make the change, districts might struggle to identify the path to get there. They might also be overwhelmed and confused with what flexibilities they can use, which again, we saw in the proficiency-based scenario. And more broadly, they might not know which specific flexibilities to use. Carolina is very fortunate, or South Carolina is fortunate in that they have a number of flexibilities, and there's different ways that schools can approach that innovation. So the result is that even when districts maybe want to move on from the status quo, they might not know exactly how to go about doing so. And then we don't see the widespread change that we're all shooting for. So this has several pieces that are going to be included in it. The first is a description and a vision of what personalized learning is, which draws heavily on the Aurora Institute's definition of personalized learning. Thank you all for creating that years ago. Second, it provides a framework for how to go about using the playbook. We didn't just want to drop this with folks without giving them some kind of guidance for how they could actually go about implementing it and using it. So what it does is it draws on a couple of resources that we have created at KnowledgeWorks, one of them being our District Conditions Toolkit, which on some level is a diagnostic that a district can use within a team of folks who are thinking about innovation to assess their readiness for innovation and determine where they might want to start on it. So that is the third bullet there. The fourth bullet, we created 5 specific entry points for schools and or districts. I think one thing that we've definitely observed is that, different districts are going to be coming at things from different angles. I'll talk more about those entry points in the next slide, but really wanting to give folks a couple of different access points, especially for districts that may never have done this before, but also be able to respond to districts that might be able to say, all right, we're fairly far along this innovation. We want to know what comes next. And then last but not least, it concludes with tips for how to progress from policies to practice and provide some additional resources. So as I alluded to in the last slide, I wanted to break down some of these entry point topic areas here. So from the entry point topic areas, the first one is really kind of the initial innovation. So how might you start things if you've never done this work before? The advice we really give here is saying there's a bunch of different ways you can start small. Maybe you start with a specific grade, or maybe you start with a specific course load, and then slowly move up to school-wide adoption. So how do you really get going if this is totally new to you? The second and third bullets are really about thinking through different ways that second one specifically, how might you be able to start providing credit for learning that occurs outside of the classroom, things like work-based learning or service learning opportunities. And again, use that as an entry point to start your school or your district on the path towards more broad, personalized, competency-based learning implementation. The third piece, really digging into some of those multiple pathways to graduation. That can include things like career and technical education programs, but we've also included examples of virtual learning opportunities, and even thinking through alternative schools that maybe try to reach students who might not thrive in a traditional school setting. So how can those types of schools utilize these flexibilities? And then fourth and not least, we have school improvement innovation. So this is thinking about what happens after you've gone through these first three entry points. How do you really sustain it over time? It's not just experimenting anymore. How do you make it part of your DNA of what you're actively doing day in and day out, and really integrate it into that long-term vision? And then last but not least, once you've done this in a school, how do you really scale this district-wide and think about how can we adopt this in more than just one school or a handful of schools? How can this just be the way that we do business as a whole district? So that is kind of our 5 entry points. So within each of these, what we break it down into is we start with a concrete example, which we've pulled from around the country. We're working with a wonderful consultant. Her name is Stephanie Krause, who's done a number of interviews with different folks in different states. And we're able to pull those in and say, here's an example of what this entry point could look like. Then we break it down to saying more broad options and characteristics of these different models within that entry point. And then to pull on, again, back to the Flex Guide resource that Sarah's put together, we can pull out specific policy flexibilities and then highlight, if you want to do these things, here are the flexibilities in South Carolina that you could use and how you might go about using them. And in recognition too of even things beyond the Flex Guide, we've also included some references where it's appropriate to things like federal dollars and how they could be used, or other flexibilities that might extend even beyond just student-centered learning flexibilities. And then last but not least, we want to leave folks with a path to what to do next. So we have some guiding questions to really help communities kind of get started on where they might want to go after this. So development process is going to look actually very similar to the proficiency-based system. We held some listening sessions around the state with districts and schools, really got some good feedback on what did folks want, what did they need, what were some confusion points they had, what was really the end goal they were shooting for, and what they wanted to see was something that could help them envision where they could go next when they wanted to innovate. So once we identified those pieces, we started looking at, again, states with similar flexibilities and looked for innovative models to highlight as concrete examples of schools or districts in those states. As I already mentioned, we conducted some follow-up interviews with schools and districts to think about going back to some of those first folks from that first bullet, what was the appropriate format for the guide, and then last but not least, interviewing exemplars to create those examples for the entry points. So this is going to be written up, designed, and released in the very near future. And again, we're hoping this will, again, draw on that piece that Sarah and her team put together and really help kind of flesh out the stepping stones pathway. Apologies for the alarm there in the background, on the stepping stones pathway to get folks from point A to point B, a vision for what they might want to ultimately shoot for and how they can really think about putting those flexibilities into practice. So that is the innovation playbook. And if you had questions on that first piece, this is a great opportunity. Again, you can throw those in or ask questions on what we just covered as well with the innovation playbook. All right, well, I see a question come in. There we go.
Okay, so for the to maintain the accountability, flexibility is used more frequently. As I said, the flexibility that we highlight in our flexibility guide is all existing flexibilities. And so we had the capacity at the state agency to be able to handle additional applications coming in from districts. And part of what we also did, though, it did give us the opportunity to rethink that and make sure that that was not only living on our internal processes in a silo where others might be blind to that, or where else could we pull folks to be able to help with that process to make sure, for example, in our Office of Federal and State Accountability, that we were not overwhelming that office. And so we did a number of internal controls and internal meetings and checkpoints to talk about what that would look like and how it may impact our work at the state agency. So that was definitely a part of the process as well. And so far, I will tell you, again, because the flexibility already exists, this was not new information. We were just trying to make sure that districts had the ability to access and leverage the flexibility that they had already been given. And so we, from the taxpayer question, one of the things that I think has been really helpful is in all of our resources, we are very explicit in the role of making sure that whatever flexibility or whatever innovation you are considering is a community-based innovation, and the importance of making sure that you're involving your parents, your students, your community members early on, because we know that that is what ultimately results in a successful implementation, is if something truly is owned and is contextualized for the specific community that's wanting to implement something. So I think that has been something that's been really helpful by just making part of the process, even in our application process. That's a major piece of it. In addition to the local school board having to have approved the application, there's also a specific section in there where you have to show that you have met with your community and that the community is in support of this as well. So we made sure that the applications are not something that's just happening by a couple of district level leaders who submit an application and try to implement something, that it truly is it's contextualized for each specific community. And so I think that is honestly a strength of part of the process we created.
And I would just add too, I think we work with a number of states all over the country, and Stephanie, one of the things I've always really appreciated about the way that you all work in South Carolina is that you're really looking to do things with communities and not to communities, which again is not always the case. And I think that that's much stronger potential for lasting impact as a result.
Yeah, I will say too, that's another piece of when we looked at the applications and we added a couple of tables in, and this actually, you can see this in the next couple of slides. John, if you want to go to this next slide really quickly, that one that says, let's get you to yes. I will say that has been our mantra, both with my office and working with the Office of Federal and State Accountability at the department. We kind of created this simple process flow for helping districts to think about it, which really were these three elements of what is it that you actually want to do, and part of what's ingrained in what you want to do. That's where I was talking about that community-based piece being there. That there's also a why do you want to do that? What's the rationale, and what do you think you're going to be able to accomplish if you move in this direction? And then we actually spend some time making sure that, like I mentioned before, that they identify what why are you not yet doing that? What's possibly standing in your way? And we look at that from 4 angles. Is it a federal reason? Is it a state reason? Is it a local district reason? Or is it maybe even a school-based reason? Is there some specific rule or policy at the school or at the district level that is something that you would want to address, and really thinking through all of the elements of where specifically are the regulations around what it is you're wanting to do. And I think that's helpful to folks to even just pause to think through those things really systemically. And then the last piece, again, getting them to think about which resources already exist, because that was often what we heard from schools and districts. That's why I think the flexibility guide partnered with the playbook is a powerful piece for folks. Because we were able to lift up examples from South Carolina schools and districts, but also national, like across the nation, what else are people doing? And in all of those cases, in none of those cases do we say, here is this thing and you should implement it as is, or try to replicate exactly what that school or district has done. All throughout the playbook, those guiding question pieces that John talked about were really important, because I think that it helps us ask our local districts to consider what has been your journey to this point. What's the reason that this is the next best step for you and why? And what will it look like in your local district? And what are the implications that you are going to have to think through? And so I think that's for us been the most powerful piece, is the dialogue and the conversations that have come as a result of.
I know Stephanie has a few more slides to close things out, but before we move on, do we have any other playbook related questions?
And John, we don't have to go through those slides. I just sort of talked through them right there. So folks have the slide deck so they'll be able to see them. I do know that Sarah had, Sarah, is that what you just dropped in, the process doc? Do you want to talk about that for just a moment? I think that'll help folks sort of take all the things we've thrown at them and see it in this way.
Sure. So I just shared in the chat just basically what we've created this framework, basically what we've talked through with you today, just so you could kind of think through. I think, what's I wanted to mention earlier is that to the question about waivers is just from a national lens, what's really unique, I think, about what Stephanie has done in South Carolina and her team is that setting this broader context for the why, and really getting districts and schools as they think about how they're going, what they actually want to do, as Stephanie just shared, getting them to articulate that. And the other piece I think that Stephanie really hasn't talked about a lot yet is really building out the professional development resources and building capacity with the tools that district and school leaders have. I mean, just beyond what we've shared today, to really help them with this mindset shift, which is pretty radical when we think about student-centered design. It takes a mindset shift. So if, as I said earlier, if a district and school leader is not really understanding what they're designing towards, they're not going to leverage these flexibilities in the right way. So I think, when we think about kind of the national landscape and just why South Carolina has been so successful, I think these building blocks that we've talked about today and that we've laid out in this framework have really created an intentional process for ensuring that we not only are amplifying flexibilities that are available to districts and schools, but there's a vision that's being set towards student-centered learning, that communities are engaged, that tools are being developed that really help weave together the available tools that districts and schools can leverage to supporting them through technical support, and then really ensuring that we have the policymaker feedback loop in place when districts and schools are actually leveraging the flexibilities that are available to them. And lastly, I just like to kind of bring up an example of a policy challenge that Stephanie and I had last year. We we had a bill, HB 3883, that we really was going to be really powerful because it was going to give district-wide flexibilities to really make this shift towards personalized competency-based learning. And we ended up just getting 1 year provisio to basically allow districts 1 year to access the flexibility. But what Stephanie's done that's been really transformational, I think, is she's worked through this part of this process is to get districts to actually start working on their plans. So Stephanie, I'd just like you to highlight how many districts you've actually engaged.
Yeah, so in South Carolina, I know different states are different sizes and have different numbers of districts. So in South Carolina, we have 78 school districts. And we have 28 districts who've opted in for that proviso. And what we are doing, I think this process of what we developed really helped us think about, all right, what do we want to build and how do we want to help districts through that? Through the listening tour, one of the things we heard is it's difficult to do it alone. If you're a small rural district and you're the chief academic officer, you wear a lot of hats. And so they really needed the ability to network with one another. So that's what we've built out for the application for accessing the competency-based ed proviso. And what we've done with that is we are meeting monthly with all the districts who are going through, and we're working through that application for them. And again, making sure they have access to all of these resources, as well as support from the state education agency, so that we're getting them real-time answers. But even more importantly, we're able to give them the opportunity to work with one another and identify, these 3 or 4 districts are all working on something very similar. And so again, they can talk about that, they can share that, they can talk about what things they are doing in their own communities that are successful and things that are working, and also talk about lessons learned and really help one another through that process. And so that has been a really powerful piece that we're very excited about, and honestly want to build in, in the spirit of continuous improvement, like as we continue to think about the way in which we have various applications and things, what's our role as a state agency? And if we really want to help get those districts to yes, we've got to consistently think about what do we need to do differently to better support districts to articulate, outline, and achieve the goals that they're working for.
And Stephanie, you have 23 districts who are working on plans, right?
Yes, it's 28. We have 28 districts.
28
districts out of the 78 are currently working on plans. I will tell you, I don't anticipate all 20 of them submitting that final application. A number of them, because we're using the flexibility guide as part of that process, a number of them have actually realized what they want to do, maybe a different flexibility is more appropriate for, or it's a smaller scope. And so I see that as a win, because what we're doing is helping them tailor what's available to their specific needs. And so I see that as a really strong point.
And then from a policy and advocacy lens, why this is so powerful is because next session, when this bill hopefully pops up again, we now have some actual concrete evidence, because all of this really intentional legwork that Stephanie has been helping to facilitate within South Carolina to really position with policymakers why additional flexibility is needed. So that to me is, just really thinking through the bigger picture of this process and work that we're doing. It's, we need to be able to touch the system from every, top down, bottom up, to really create and ensure that the flexibilities are in place to continue building up on the work.
Stephanie, while folks are potentially thinking of other questions, I did have one I want to toss your way. So one thing that we hear consistently as we engage with states around the country is that, well, we're a local control state. We don't want to, require anyone does anything, which, as a side note, I'd love to have a competition to see who is the most local control state when it comes to education someday. But that aside, I think, you talked about there's 28 districts that are currently working on this budget proviso that you just talked about. There are dozens of districts that are doing things. We've heard all over the state as we work through these two applications and the playbook with you all. Is any of this mandated from a state standpoint? Like what's the requirement that's placed on districts? Do they have to do this?
Short answer, none of it's mandated. So flexibility that we have, it's opt-in. And I will say, going back to where we talked about at the beginning and sort of why our office was created, and the thing that's mandated for us is the profile of the South Carolina graduate. That's codified, and so all districts are working towards that. That is, we built out competencies to help districts get a better a way to be able to measure that, to make it transparent. But again, they don't have to use even those competencies. There's the flexibility and the freedom to really be able to show how they're implementing the profile of the graduate on their own. But again, thinking about the state role, it is really nice that we have these resources and tools available to districts that they can use. I will say, even with our office, and you can go back, I don't, all the things on that slide early on that show all of the different types of professional learning and things that we offer, that's not even all of it. Like, it's sort of a big smattering of it. But even that work, in South Carolina, we don't have a grant program for this work. Districts do not get any additional funding or anything to engage with our office or to take on any of this work. And we actually see that as a positive. I think what we see is districts and school leaders are coming to the table because there are very specific, legitimate things that they are wrestling with and are trying to solve for as they think about continuous improvement and making sure all their students can achieve that profile of a South Carolina graduate. And so it's really been powerful to watch the work sort of spread in some ways and scale in other ways across the state. And I think that the fact that it's not mandated in some ways has been really helpful for us, because districts are much more open to what that looks like in their own community.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie.
Okay, well, we've done a little bit of wait time. I do know that I will just say, if last sort of thing before we close up, I think for anyone else who's on the call that's with a state education agency or in a similar type of role, I would say two things that have been just very, very beneficial for us throughout the process. One is the ability to network with other state education agencies and similarly situated folks to really hear and learn with one another and from one another what's happening in their state. A lot of the ideas we've shared today are things that I took from all of the different opportunities to network with other state education agencies. And so first we'll just say thank you to everybody out there who's doing lots of great work that we can draw on and that we can think about for ourselves in a similar way that we're asking our districts to do for themselves. Like, we're taking what you've done in your state and thinking about what it could look like and might be in South Carolina. And that has been so helpful. So thanks to everybody who is way ahead of us in this work for being transparent and willing to share. And the second thing is, I think it's really critical that we had the ability to draw on some external partners. And so in this particular case, for these tools that we're talking about, working with the folks at ExcelinEd and working with the folks at KnowledgeWorks really helped us broaden our perspective and think about things in a more strategic way. And so I think having external partners just to thought partner with you, to run things by, and also to access their network, that has been really beneficial as well. Being able to take something that, yeah, we could have completely done this on our own, but I know for sure that the product would not be nearly as robust or comprehensive because we've been able to really blend great examples of things happening here in South Carolina with fantastic examples of things happening across the country. And so I think that helps our folks both feel affirmed and also inspired at the same time. So thanks to our partners.
Thank you, Stephanie. I will just add on top of that, just to reinforce what you're saying, the general sense that I've gotten from the year and a half that I've been doing this work with KnowledgeWorks is that rarely are you, probably as a state, you being any state out there, going to be the first one doing some of this work. So there's typically always someone out there who's has some good lessons that you can learn from, or is doing something similar. So I know we're always happy when we can help spread those best practices.
Okay, well, if there are no further questions, perfectly right on time, our Aurora Institute Tech Support, if there is a session survey that we need you to complete, you can see that link just dropped into the chat. And this will give you a few minutes to actually be able to do that before we end. So please make sure you click on that. And again, if you need to contact any of the three of us, we're all available, willing, and love to collaborate. So thank you so much for joining us today, and let us know if we can be of any assistance.